Welcome, guys. We have a podcast with an old friend of mine, Megan Schaller. Megan is a doctoral student in the Biomedical Sciences program at the University of Michigan with a focus in molecular physiology. As a scientist, she researches intestinal health while navigating higher education with ADHD. So it's so great to have you on the podcast, Megan. Thanks for
joining, Megan.
Time out of your busy schedule to get on here with us. Sam and I are super into, we like health. We're interested in health. And we listen to a lot of experts like yourself on like podcasts like Joe Rogan. So you're our first real like science expert we get to have on. So that's really exciting for us because we've always wanted to have like someone that actually does research in science in the field. So thanks so much. Let's start out with these fun pop questions. I call them like icebreaker questions. And they just, they're in the different like interests categories that we talk about on the podcast. They're all kind of random questions. Just answer what first comes to your mind. And answer these more quickly. You don't have to go into like a whole lot of depth with these questions because they're not like really about your expertise.
Sure.
But but they can be involved with your expertise, like this one maybe. Favorite hardware, software, or app that's not super common? Like don't say your iPhone, but is there anything that you have that you really like?
Honestly, this is a nerdy answer, but I really get a lot out of Slack. It stops me from having a million emails in my inbox. And so I'd say that's my favorite.
Slack, the work messaging app?
Yeah.
I use that. I just started using that.
Yeah, it's a boring one, but it's pretty useful.
Yeah, that's really cool. What all do you do on there? Just message people or?
So I have two different labs that I work in. And so all of the people in each lab are connected through Slack. And so we send individual messages and we're able to keep up on like all of the meetings, and I can ask people for help with experiments and things like that. And so it seems to be pretty useful. Apart from the regular ones.
Yeah, that's a good one. Music section. What is an artist that you've been listening to a lot lately?
Well, I'm a huge Taylor Swift fan, so I've been listening to that album, her Evermore. But I also love Lauren Daigle, so I listen to her quite a bit.
I love Taylor Swift too, as I'm sure you know.
I know you do.
Health. What is something you do to take care of your health?
Recently, I've been trying to cut out time to read books, like personal growth books. But with a busy schedule, I have to kind of schedule that in. So I've been trying to be more mindful of that. So that's what I do. I also have gotten into adult coloring. So I color while I watch TV and just relax. But that'd be a big part of my mental health, I would say.
I like that.
I like that too, yeah.
What is one of your favorite places to buy clothes?
Oh, gosh. I would say just Old Navy, probably. Not the most interesting.
That's funny because his roommate...
they have really good stuff. I didn't know. Yeah, my roommate just started working there, and so he's been getting both of us some stuff from there. And I was surprised at how good it is, yeah.
Yeah, with the pandemic, his roommate was a manager at a restaurant and it was shut down. So he had to take on a new job, and it's got some perks. Lots of nice clothes. Who is your celebrity crush? You had to pick.
Oh gosh. Put me on the spot. Sorry, I can't.
Rachel's was Zac Efron.
Okay, that's a good. Who do I love? So not a celebrity crush, but I love Demi Lovato. I'm pretty impressed with how she's handled everything in her life, and I think she's a pretty good role model So.
Yeah. And she's hot. So
She is.
I can say that, but he can't. That's the rule here.
That's fair. That's fair.
What is, oh, you mentioned self-improvement. What is your favorite self-improvement book you've read, or just a philosophy that has been really influential in your life?
I'm big into the concept of grace, I would say. So I have a couple books about that and kind of like developing my emotional intelligence. I found that that's really helped me interact and like communicate with my friends and coworkers. And so a philosophy I would guess is I just try to remind myself that to try to be forgiving and kind of try to, if someone hurts my feelings or something, try to think of what could be happening in their life to where they could have chosen to do the things that they do. And that really adds a sense of calm, taking that approach to things, I would say.
I like that a lot, especially I'm sure since you're getting your doctorate, you're around people that are always escalating their book smarts and their research, their that intelligence, but the fact that you've taken time to also focus on your emotional intelligence, that's really cool. I like that.
Yeah, I'm lucky to be in a lab surrounded with other grad students that also like place a priority in developing their emotional intelligence. And so that's really been a huge help for me learning how to, develop really good friendships and things like that. And so, yeah, definitely we're taught the science stuff, but we're not taught in a doctorate how to be like emotionally mature or how to treat people. So that's something that as a scientist, I try to make a point to focus on outside of science.
Yeah, I had never even really heard the word emotional intelligence until he used it around me. Mm-hmm. And I was like, why isn't that something like we talk about more when it comes to like intelligence? I never thought of myself as intelligent because in the book smart area, I'm not really like super intelligent, but I think I have a good emotional intelligence, when I'm like one-on-one with someone.
Yeah, which in my opinion, that's equally important.
Like awkward on Zoom, but
yeah, that's just as important in my book. So that's not a bad thing at all.
So what are the two labs that you?
And that's we're done with the pop questions now. Just so you know.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks.
Yeah. So what are
the two labs?
Yeah. Go ahead.
That I work in. So the first one I work in on a daily basis is researching aging and how to using model organisms like they primarily use microscopic worms to figure out how to make an organism stay healthier longer into their life. And so the goal with aging labs isn't really to just extend your life. No one wants to have their physical health fail just to live longer, so we're more focused on making sure that you can maintain your health longer in your life. So that's one aspect, one lab that I work in. And then the other one is kind of completely different. It's focused more on intestinal health. So they primarily study colon cancer and specifically how colon cancer starts to develop. And so that's where my intestinal focus comes in. And so my research project kind of combines the both. And I'm lucky to have fantastic mentors from both labs. So my research specifically looks at the intestine and how its health and integrity changes as a person ages or when they undergo different environmental stresses, and how that can hurt the intestine.
Wow. Very cool. And can you so that's your thesis then?
Yeah, that's my dissertation project.
Or dissertation. Yep. And what was your hypothesis? So at what stage of the dissertation are you?
So I'm in my third year. So we take classes our first year, and then we have to pass exams that can kind of show that you're ready to be able to take on a project by yourself. So I've passed those criteria. I finished all my classes. So now I just do research full time. So over the last year and a half in my lab, I've kind of worked hard to get my project up and running and get kind of a good base foundation of data so I can tailor my hypotheses more specifically to try to get at exactly what's happening in the intestine. And so the goal with this research would be to, if we can figure out how the intestine breaks down and the things that can speed that breakdown or make it worse, then we can discover things that will help prevent that breakdown of the intestine. So I've got, I would say I'm about to start the in-depth research of developing my dissertation. So I've got a lot of the preliminary data, enough to be able to think what's going on. And now I'm about to dive into the more specific experiments, I would say.
And in a general sense, it sounds like maybe you're still nailing down the hypothesis, but can you kind of give us a general idea of what it is?
Sure. So I would say my kind of overarching or central hypothesis is that the interaction of the gut bacteria in your intestine can, when you have an organism that is less protected from the environmental stressors that one would undergo, that eventually leads to their intestine, the integrity of it to start to break down. And then that can become pathogenic. And I don't know if you've heard of like leaky gut syndrome.
I was going to ask if that's the same.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
It's the same concept. Yeah. So we want to keep the things inside of the intestine there. And as soon as they are able to start leaking into the body cavity or into the organism, then they can cause problems. So my hypothesis, studying the genes that I study, is how to maintain that intestinal barrier. So we prevent things from leaking out into the rest of the body and causing those problems.
And so like, it's obvious to me, right, that it's like a large part of it is probably influenced by diet, but like, what are some other things that influence like the integrity of intestine of an organism?
Sure. So they, not only the diet, but also like the different populations of bacteria. So there's a ton of different bacteria in your intestine. And so
it's like is it like billions? Isn't it like billions of different ones?
Yeah, like, there's a lot. Yeah.
So I've like learned like some stuff about the gut biome, but not that much, but I kind of understand like conceptually, I guess, what it is.
Sure. Which honestly, if you don't do the research of it, you don't really need to understand like the nitty gritty. Like if you can read a research article and get the main gist of it, that's going to be enough to be able to help you.
Yeah.
Like determine what diet things you want to change.
Yeah. Yeah. I only have a bachelor's degree, but I did it in psychology. So I actually worked in a lab for a couple of years, but so I had to read a lot of research papers, and then that kind of like helped me just to know how to do that once I kind of became obsessed with nutrition, like I said.
Yeah, that's something that a lot of people don't know how to pick out the parts that are meaningful, because there's a lot of like science jargon, that is important for other scientists to read, but for like the general population, it's really a good skill to be able to read a research article and take the important things from it,
Yeah. Yeah. And like, and I'm not good at this. I mean, because I see it on like YouTube. I watch a lot of like YouTube nutrition videos and stuff. And like, there's people who will like summarize a study, and like most people who are just like, oh my God, they're using research. Like they must be right. And they must know what they're talking about. But it's so complicated to actually analyze like someone's methods. Like I said, I can't, I'm not saying I can do that, but like, it's very, very hard. I mean, you have to, I don't know. You have to have education in it to be able to do it.
Very complex. And that's basically what the first couple years in my PhD program is teaching us, is how to like be able to critique other people's research and methods. So just because a paper has been published in like scientific journal doesn't necessarily mean that it's the best, that you can take the results as gold, right? So you need to still kind of maintain the ability to decide whether or not the evidence backs up what they're saying. And that's a really important skill that we're taught in my program, is how to identify where we could have made things better in the methodology, and like how we can design experiments to really tell us the most that we can get out of these experiments. But that's a really good skill that you've developed for sure.
Yeah.
The phrase I've learned is correlation doesn't mean causation.
Oh my gosh, I'm so proud of you. That's like day one, what we're taught. Like, just because
a lot of people don't even understand that. I mean,
they don't.
That's all I've learned.
Hey, that's good. And that's partially, I mean, I feel kind of a responsibility to kind of help the people around me and the people in my life like understand part of that, because I think there's a big lack. Like, we have all of the science jargon and all of these papers, and there's kind of a break between that and the general population. And so I think I personally feel kind of a responsibility to help bridge that gap, so our science can be used by more people, but part of that will include teaching people that haven't been taught how to read articles and how to get things from them.
I think that's so cool. I mean, I completely agree with you, because that's something that I saw just when I was, working in labs and getting my bachelor's, like it's like so separate, the world of like academia, where people are on the like cutting edge of making these groundbreaking discoveries and like falsifying different things that maybe we used to think were true. And, and then there's like common sense, like popular knowledge almost. And the gap is just huge. And then a lot of people that I met, at least in academia, were like, they didn't even really care about actually educating the population. And it was it was honestly kind of frustrating to me. And
sure.
I was
it's like even in the medical field, it seems like they're behind on things. And like, if I were to bring up, hey doctor, I think I might have this leaky gut syndrome, they're going to act like, oh, this girl's been on WebMD too long. Leaky gut's not something we treat. Like, do you find that at all? Like, do doctors take leaky gut syndrome seriously? Or
I would say,
how often does someone do you think there's a lot of people that have leaky gut that like aren't treated for it at all?
I think definitely. I mean, there is like a delay in what we find in research and then getting it to being able for doctors to be able to treat humans with that disease, just because a lot of times, which is the prime example with leaky gut, like we're just now realizing, and we don't even understand the gravity of it, how much your gut influences the rest of your organism or the rest of the body. And so, like, for example, some bacteria in the gut, say a bacteria feeds on sugar in the gut. And so we're really just starting to discover that the gut bacteria in someone can interact with their brain. And for example, that bacteria, if they like eating sugar, then we found, not me specifically, but the field has found that there's crosstalk between the gut and the brain to get the person to eat things that are more sugary, which is crazy to me. And I find it fascinating that like your gut is talking to your brain. Yeah. And so that's like, we need to discover, or we need to find out really more about a disease. And then eventually it gets to where MDs or clinicians can treat it. But there is definitely a gap or a length of time where we're still discovering it, because we don't want to have the clinicians treat someone with it if we don't actually understand wholly what's going on, because the humans aren't the experimental, we don't want to experiment on humans before we figure out what's actually going on. But I do say that I would think that a lot of people probably have leaky gut, or it slightly, that doesn't manifest into like super serious problems. And so I would say that a lot more people have it than we realize. They just haven't started to develop symptoms that we recognize associated with leaky gut right now.
And how does So I've heard this before, like the sugar example, and I think that's becoming like, I don't know. My mom's told me about that, and she's not a scientist, but like, how does it actually? What's the mechanism that happens?
So
We might not be able to fully get it, but like, if you can try to give us an idea.
Sure. So it's the cellular, like on a cellular level, it's like mind blowing how much different cells in different areas of the body, different cells within the same organ, how they are able to talk. So it's thought to be that they can use different molecules. They can send molecules from cell type to cell type, or they can use the nervous system and send signals to different cells and different neurons in the body. It's like, it can't be understated how complex it is, and we're still honestly figuring it out. And so I would say there's no one like quick answer of how the gut can talk to the brain, but it's utilizing these different cell-to-cell communication tactics, which is kind of what one of my lab studies is, how the nervous system talks to the intestine, and how, like, for example, how your brain can tell you when you're hungry, which is a more basic example, but then we've also got hormones and chemicals involved. So it's just a crazy complex, system going on. And the more I study it and the more I get in depth with it, the more I'm like in awe that we can even live, like there's so many different things going on. And we as scientists don't even understand all of it. And we find new things every day that are like mind blowing. And so I think with the amount of like research, like development of different things where we can test things in the body, I think in the next like 20 to 30 years, we're going to find some extremely cool things. But back to the break between the academia and the general population, I think that it's easy to get in, as a scientist in academia, it's easy to get lost in this cool science that we're doing. And it's easy to forget that if people can't understand what you're doing in the papers that you write, then you're really missing out on a whole population that could benefit from your research if we're not also making efforts to make it more, consumable from a general population standpoint, if that makes sense.
Yeah, well said.
Yeah, I started diving into some of the science, or just reading articles about depression being linked to like IBS and Crohn's.
Yeah,
and I actually had a friend, her boyfriend was diagnosed with Crohn's, and they put him on the keto diet, which to me was it's kind of weird, because a lot of people are like, for example, Rachel had IBS, and she told us she was actually, the meat was triggering her. Mm-hmm. But for someone like him who has Crohn's, I bet they did that because of what you just said, the sugar, it feeding on the sugar.
And I'm not a clinician, so I can't give medical advice to patients, obviously, but I think it's definitely, because it's so complex, it becomes more of a patient-to-patient basis. And like Crohn's and IBS, the way that they're caused and how they develop could be completely different in one patient with IBS compared to another patient with IBS. And so I think moving into the more tailored approach, which is where I hope medicine ends up moving towards in the next few years, is more being able to determine what's best for this person compared to another person based off of or instead of doing like an umbrella approach. Like if you have IBS, I'm going to give you this medicine and we'll try that first. But I think identifying what the triggers of these two diseases is really going to be an important part of treatment moving forward, I would say.
I love that your research is on the gut, because when I started finding out some of these, we don't really know for sure, but we think like the gut is way more connected to the brain than we ever thought. I was like, mm-hmm. Oh my God, I've been lied to. I felt like I had been lied to. Like our gut is so like, it might be like just as important as the brain. And when I started thinking about it, it was like, that's why we get gut feelings like in scary situations. You know what I mean? Like, and we never think of our gut as this, like, we think of like our heart and our brain as like these sacred thing, but we don't think of our gut is like maybe doing some of the thinking for us. You know what I mean?
Sure. Yeah.
And it's kind of crazy.
It is crazy. I find it fascinating. Like your heart has to pump for you to stay alive, and your brain obviously has to be good for you to stay alive. But the quality of that life and the different things that your body's feeling on a day-to-day basis, I think is largely like we don't even understand how much the gut is incorporated in that. And so it's really become, there's a lot more research going on regarding the gut and its influence on the body now compared to even 10 years ago. So I think it's definitely moving in the right direction. But you mentioned something that I wanted to point out, that you felt lied to. Like this is pretty common, I would say, not to get political, but I know that I've spoken to a lot of people that like recommendations from the CDC with the pandemic, they feel that they're being misled, and because the recommendations are changing. And that's where I would like to point out that like, that's kind of how hypotheses work, like since it was such a new thing, they formed hypotheses and they tested them. And then each experiment that we do as scientists is designed to increase our knowledge and get us closer to understanding what's actually going on in the body. And so that's, I would say, as research develops, it's not, I want to point out that it's not the scientists trying to like misinform people, it's just the more we test, the more we figure out. And then as a scientist, we adjust our hypotheses in the model of what we think is going on based off of the additional knowledge that we just got from our data, So luckily, I think it's definitely, like I said, 10 years ago, probably we definitely didn't know how much the gut is involved with the brain. But now we're realizing that we don't know how much we don't know, which it's really, really fascinating. There's been like, I know I've read studies with children with autism with like fecal transplants, and that has improved their symptoms, and depression and anxiety, and even like ADHD, for example. There's specific diets that are people have found to help them with their symptoms with all of these things. And I think there's definitely like a physiological mechanism of why. We just might not understand specifically what nutrients are helping, but that's where the tailored, treatment also comes in. Like something that helps my ADHD symptoms might be different than a food that helps someone else. So that's where diet also comes into play quite a bit, I would say.
Have you done anything, because you do gut research, does that mean you've added anything into your diet, like maybe a probiotic or something that you're super strict on now that you weren't necessarily before?
Yeah, so I definitely am a lot more aware of keeping my gut healthy, I would say, because my labs do study of what happens when the gut breaks down. We can see, which I'm 26, our guts might not be in a bad way now, but we also want to be able to preserve the function of the gut as we age. And so I take a probiotic. I think that more importantly, if I'm ever on antibiotics or anything, I make a point to take probiotics or prebiotics even afterwards, because antibiotics are pretty mess up your gut bacteria and your microbiome quite a bit. And so I think resetting that is by the use of these probiotics is a good thing that I definitely practice.
So, I see a lot of people in, promoting one diet or a supplement or another, and not probiotics, but like, I know a lot of guys are bullshitting, but are there recommendations that are like pretty universal for diet, let's say, or like, cause I know this guy and he claims like that his diet plan promotes gut health. And it's like, I've always wondered, like, how can he actually say that? You know what I mean?
So this is kind of not a controversial, it's funny that you say this because I have a background in exercise physiology. And so that involved a lot of nutrition, learning about nutrition. And so I would say you kind of have to go on a case by case basis. You know, I'm not personally a fan of any fad diet. I don't think that the claims that certain people promoting them can be backed up by the science of it, you know. Now, saying more of this is a gut healthy diet, it depends on if this person has, you know, looked into scientific articles and read the research. And I don't want to discount this person, you know, if a person promoting a diet has done a lot of research, reading up on articles in peer-reviewed journals specifically, that go through like a vetting process to make sure that their science checks out before the article is published, then they might be incorporating some of those like research results into their diet recommendations. But in regards to like keto or Atkins, or, you know, I'm less likely to be comfortable suggesting someone go on those. I would say the more universal thing that I believe in more is more like from the not as processed aspect. So I like everything in moderation. I try to eat things more from the ground, I call it. So, you know, which falls into the less processed aspect of it. I think when we process food, we lose a lot of the nutritional value. And so I personally, just from a health standpoint, I'm more of the universal recommendation from me would be to just do from the ground, you know, don't overcook things. Don't, you know, keep a reasonable level of fats and cholesterol and things like that. I don't claim to follow any like fad diets.
So like one of the claims, and I'm sorry if I'm going like too off topic here, this will be the last thing I'll ask, but one of the, like, so in this guy's diet, and it's like, he co-authored it with a guy who has his PhD in nutrition. So I've always thought like, oh, this sounds kind of legit, but I'm wondering like this specific thing, like he talks about like the vegetables and fruits he includes in the plan are low FODMAP. Are you familiar with that? I wasn't. It's like low gas, basically. Like there's like an index where you can, like broccoli is like very high gas because it like builds gas in your stomach or something.
Oh yeah, I've heard broccoli's better for you if you cook it.
I don't know. But have you ever, is that like,
I don't know.
So like, like the whole foods are better for your gut biome than like processed foods. It sounds like that's like a pretty universal thing, but anything other than that, is that kind of like at some point it's kind of like, we don't really know yet.
So if it's published by someone that, you know, it seems like, I would always say if they have references in their book, then that's a good sign that they've kind of perused the available research. And so I haven't personally looked into that, but it wouldn't surprise me if there's some research out of vegetables or fruits that are more, keep your gut at more of a homeostatic level. So keep your gut healthy. I would have to look into the research before making suggestions, obviously. But I would say anything with a book written by a PhD, you know, with references. And if they actually describe why this is better, then I think that's also a good sign. Instead of just telling you this is what you should do, you know, if he describes like the physiological reason why this is better, then I would definitely, as long as it's not something too drastic, I wouldn't discount trying it, you know?
Yeah. And, so is there like, I just don't understand the gut biome that well, obviously, but like, is there, So it seems like to me, like from the way I understand it, like there's a certain level of like, okay, your gut biome is, the makeup of it is determined by like your consistent food habits. And so somebody that maybe eats like a highly, like a standard American diet, it's like very high in fat, very high in carbs, very processed, like you said, like, I feel like maybe is it the case where their gut biome is now so markedly different than somebody like one of us who eats more whole foods that like they can digest that type of food more easily and assimilate it more easily? Whereas like sometimes if I have like a day where I eat a bunch of shitty food, I like feel like, oh my, like I feel like dead. I feel like hungover. Is that part of it? Is like the gut biome that's...
I would say that that's definitely part of it. I was going to use the example of if you don't eat McDonald's for months and then you eat a McDonald's meal, your stomach is all sorts of upset. And I think that's definitely something that is probably due to the bacteria being able to handle that type of food, so maybe, and so the gut microbiome from person to person is going to be wildly different based off of, like you said, their consistent diet choices. But yeah, that's definitely something that if you eat more of an American diet, you're probably more able to process that American diet rather than throwing a curveball at your gut bacteria and saying, hey, digest this when you're not used to digesting it. Yeah. You probably don't have the populations of bacteria that are good at digesting that high fat diet, those high fat foods. You probably don't have as many of those since you don't eat as many high fat foods, So it's super complex, obviously, but like the populations of different types of bacteria and the bacteria that do certain things are definitely going to make a difference on the symptoms that you feel in your body and the symptoms that manifest from these diet choices that you're making, I would say.
Didn't you used to work in a lab that studied Alzheimer's?
Yes. So we studied it more on a mouse level. So we studied the breakdown of the blood-brain barrier, which I was kind of a little bit separate from that lab. But we definitely studied like the neuronal breakdown from high-fat diet. It was diet-based, you're right. So we had high-fat diet and then low-fat diet. And we also had diets that were sourced from lard versus fish oil. So fish oil is considered more of the healthy fat. So that was actually my master's thesis project, was looking at the changes in diet in mice and how that affected, I looked at the development of fatty liver disease, but we also looked at the brain and how the blood-brain barrier was affected based off of those diets. And there definitely seems to be more, just from a general sense, we found that diets that, even though they were high fat, the ones that were sourced from fish oil, they didn't gain weight like high fat mice. And which is pretty interesting when we had a high fat lard mice, high fat fish oil mice, and the high fat fish oil mice looked like they were on a low fat diet for the last 30 weeks. So weight wise, there was a big difference. And then also we found that eating healthier fats made for a much healthier liver. Your metabolism is better off, is more efficient than the high fat lard based diets, which I would consider more of like the American diet. Definitely kind of wreaked havoc on a lot of organ systems in the mice that we studied. Yeah. So
when you say if I wanted to make my diet high fat fish oil, I just need to be eating more fish?
Yeah. So you would be, which you can supplement fish oil, or you can eat more fish. Yeah. So fish versus like red meat or kind of the unhealthier meat. There's definitely some, the oils that are sourced from fish seem to be, which this isn't, my master's thesis wasn't the only ones that found that. It seems to have a very broad benefit throughout your body. So not just on your liver and your blood-brain barrier. We found that like their cholesterol levels were lower, even though they were eating the same amount of fat. So it seems to be more important the type of fat rather than the amount of fat that you're eating.
Is it the omega-3 to omega-6 ratio that makes it different? The fish versus the lard? Yeah.
Yeah. Good job.
Question. Have you seen anything about aspartame giving people Alzheimer's or being linked to leaky gut or like bad gut?
So I'd have to do a quick search for articles. I can personally tell you that I stopped drinking things with aspartame in it a few years ago, just because it seems suspicious, like there's been enough data that has said that it's harmful for me to not drink it, but I also don't drink pop and I never have. So I don't have that, craving for pop that I want to drink diet versus regular, because I do think that sugar is a big thing as well, which I personally love sweets. And so I definitely still eat sugar. But
fun fact, Megan is a really great cake decorator as well.
Nice.
She used to
this brings up a good question. So like you said, like, I could do a quick search on it. Is there, like, I know when I was in school, like I had access to like a database for research articles. Like, is there something that like just the average person, like where can the average person?
Yeah, definitely. So I would say one of the main ones that even we have access to a lot of different databases through the university, but we use Google Scholar. That's my go-to for anything. Like if you just search, for example, you could search leaky gut and aspartame, and there's probably some articles that have been published, which that doesn't mean that you're going to read the titles and take that as gold, but it's never a bad thing to inform yourself more of what's out there. I think.
Yeah. Cause I think Sam had an issue with one of those studies. They were giving them way more aspartame than like a human would ever take it. Something like that. And
that's where being able to like, kind of like, I say reading isn't a bad thing if you maintain your ability to like complexly think about it, like if you read it and you realize that, this is 10 times more aspartame than I would typically have, a human would have, then obviously the results aren't going to be as applicable to what we would see from a human drinking diet pop, And so that's definitely, I say, read as much as you can, but also don't believe it outright. Like you can still critique things. And the more you read, the more you're going to get an idea of what's a properly designed project, and so the more you read, the more you're going to be able to detect, hey, that's a little off. Like, why are they doing this versus this? I think it's good to, when you read that much, you start to ask questions like, what if I add this into the equation? Or, and I definitely think that's not a bad thing. That's my whole job, is asking questions. So, but Google Scholar is reputable. It's also, there are some journals that are not peer reviewed, which I would say steer clear of those more often than reading peer reviewed articles. And by peer reviewed, I mean that, like, if I were to submit my project in a manuscript form to a scientific journal, it would go through, like, the editor would read it and make sure everything checks out. And then they would send it out to, if they decide they want to publish it in their journal, they would send it out to different reviewers, they're called. And so that would be like subject matter experts. And so those experts are critiquing your design, your results, how you're discussing them, if you're interpreting these results as you should, and so you really get that expert viewpoint. And then a lot of times the reviewers will send the paper back to you and say, hey, if you do this experiment and this experiment and this experiment, you can really make stronger claims from this. And so they give you advice on what to do to make the paper better. And so that all comes with a peer reviewed journal, whereas that doesn't come with it. There's just more of a criteria of checkpoints that you have to go through to make sure that your research is sound and makes sense. And so Google Scholar is a good way to make sure that you're looking at those peer reviewed articles that have been vetted like that.
Yeah. Thanks. That's a good tip. I like just recently learned about Google Scholar, and yeah.
Oh, really?
I use that for my for some of my journalism papers, but it's been a long time since I got on there.
Yeah. And it is free. And I find it, I'm a huge nerd, obviously, but I find it fascinating. You can search like any keywords and you're going to find articles on it, and you can read about things that you didn't know were connected at all. And it has more things than just medical articles as well. So I would definitely, even if you just go play with it for a while, like entering in your favorite topics, you'll probably learn something, which is something I strive to do quite a bit. Like keep learning. Like I don't want to get, bored with my current knowledge. I don't want to get stagnant. So I definitely would suggest that.
Lifelong learner.
Lifelong student.
What is a normal day for you as a scientist? Do you still play with rats at all, or?
So I never played with rats. I did. Playing isn't necessarily the word. So I work with cells, and I also work with mice and the microscopic worms that I was talking about earlier. So I'm lucky as a graduate student to not have to teach to fund me. So at some universities, people have to teach undergrad classes in order to get their salary paid.
Is that because you got a scholarship or something?
So it depends on the university. So at the University of Michigan, we're technically through the medical school. And so we're lucky to be able to, I had to teach one semester just to get the experience, but then I don't have to teach the rest of the time. So I have we've got a lot of training grants, they're called. And so they're grants that have been funded with the priority of training doctoral students. So I've received a fellowship through one of these training grants. And so that like pays my salary. But back to day to day, sorry, I got distracted. So I'm able to make my own schedule. It depends from lab to lab how much flexibility you have with that. My mentor is a very relaxed, very reasonable guy. He has a wife and 3 kids at home, so he really understands the work-life balance aspect of it, which is really important and what I was looking for in a mentor. Some scientists, you will be expected to work 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, and I didn't want that, obviously. So I think that's important when looking for a lab. So I go in, and depending on what experiments I've got going, that completely defines my day. So my days are different all the time. So for example, I've got worm experiments where I've got these different chemicals that I'm introducing to the worms. And I've got this cool experiment where if the worm's gut is compromised, so if their intestine is leaky, then there's this dye that should stay in the intestine, but when the intestine is leaky, it spreads throughout the body and the worm becomes blue. So it's very easy to determine, and I'm talking little tiny worms, not earthworms. I thought they were earthworms when I first started in the lab. But so I've got those experiments going on. So adding different chemicals to see what hurts the intestine and what protects the intestine. We also do a lot of like genetic manipulation. And so if we shut off a gene in a worm and we treat it with an environmental stress that humans would experience, is that worm more worse off without that gene? And so if that's the case, then we could say that gene plays a role in protecting the intestine. So I've got those experiments going on. And then I also work with mice. And so the mice you do a lot less experiments with mice because we're really, it's a big point in biomedical research to use the least amount of animals possible. So as we're not taking advantage of this model organism, So for those, I've got mice that are just growing right now. And then I will eventually put them on different diets or give them different stressors, and then I'll be able to take their organs and see what's going on. And we can test thousands of things from one mouse. So it's also pretty important that you test as many things possible using the mice that you have. And so I'll do that sometimes. Next week, I'm making baby intestines from mice, which is pretty cool. So I'm sorry, I might be getting too nerdy, but we can take a mouse and take part of its intestine, and then there's a way that we figured out how to have the intestinal cells grow in culture. So we can do experiments on them without needing more mice. And so that's, it's a lot of like bench work, like you see what you picture scientists with their lab coat and they're pipetting things from one place to the other. And so it's a lot of that and like molecular science, if that makes sense. So, but it's different every day. There's also some writing. I have to give certain presentations quite a bit. We've got like lab meetings where we all meet everyone in the lab to discuss our data and what it means. And so it's really, which is good for me. I don't get bored with my day-to-day schedule. So it looks pretty different every day.
I can totally see you doing that, because I remember like having science classes with you, and when we would have the lab session, I would like not even be done reading the assignment and you would have already finished it, and you were my partner. So then I would just write everything
I'm so
down.
Sorry.
And that was like, so like whenever we had a lab day, it was like, well, Megan's going to do it. And it was like, it's like, you weren't the kind of person that was like, I hate doing all the work. Like you were the like kind of person that's like, I want to be doing all the work.
Yeah. That doesn't surprise me.
Sam had to go use the restroom. But I wanted to ask you on that note, what made you interested in science and why you chose it as your occupation?
So I would say that the number one thing that made me choose this career field is the learning potential. So because I have ADHD, I get bored pretty easily, and I didn't want to, establish a career and then get bored with it. And I also think it's really important to keep learning. And with science in this field, you can learn and research every day for 300 years, and you're still going to learn more the next day, And so that was the main reason, the learning potential being endless, is why I chose the science field. And then also I'm just pretty nerdy. And so I find all of it really fascinating. And so obviously there's ups and downs and there's tough times, especially in a doctoral program. But I feel like I'm being pushed on a regular basis to further my skills and to become a better scientist. And so that's something that's really confirmed that I made the right career choice, is that I'm able to keep learning.
Yeah. You're a total girl boss. You've accomplished so much.
Thank you. So have you.
You grew up in a small town and you've lived in St. Louis area and now Michigan. And I'm not super familiar with how big of a town you live in Michigan. I'm guessing it's a lot bigger than Carthage. Which area has been your... The
school itself is like 10 times or 20 times bigger probably.
Which area has been your favorite to live and why?
Oh, good question. So yes, we grew up in when I describe where I grew up to people around here, I just say it's in the middle of a cornfield, because that's basically what it was, And so then I moved down by St. Louis, and that was, so to reference, Carthage, where we grew up, has 2,800 people, right? And so the town I moved to down by St. Louis had 25,000. And then Ann Arbor, which is where I'm at now, has 125,000. So I'm like steadily going up quite a bit. This is definitely the largest city that I've lived in. And it's not even like, I talked to my friends that came from California and they're like, this isn't even a large city. And I'm like, oh my, it is. So there's there was benefits to everything, each of those towns. When I go back home, I just visited back home for the holidays. And it's very family oriented, everyone sees everyone all the time. And there's benefits to that. The town that I lived in by St. Louis, I had a really great experience with my college that I went to, that it wasn't too big. I didn't feel overwhelmed, but it was big enough to give me the opportunities that I would need to move forward with the career that I wanted. And so there was also cool things to do. St. Louis is 20 miles away, so we could always go into St. Louis and do all of the fun things there. I would say if I could remove the part of being so far away from my family and friends, I would say Ann Arbor is my favorite, simply because there's so much to do. Like, there's cool breweries and wineries to go check out. There's national parks. Like, you hear bad things about Michigan winters, but like April to October, it's fantastic. It's like 85 degrees and sunny. And so the winter is worth it, the snowy winters. So I would say that there's a lot of things to do, like outside. Like, there's floating in the summer, you float down a river. Like, there's different hiking things and a lot of different lakes that you can go walk around. And so I would say, based off of the culture, Ann Arbor is definitely my favorite. And it's also very diverse. And so that's something that since moving, like, I'm the only one in my family that's moved away so far. And so that's been a huge kind of, back home, we don't have a lot of diversity at all. We see the same type of people that look the same way. And when I move here, I've been able to experience all of the other, world views, and people that have, people that have had completely different lives than me. And I learned so much just being able to interact with them. And so that's something that I really have enjoyed, moving to a bigger city, and so, but it is very hard to be so far away from my family and friends. I'm about 8 hours away from my family now, and I'm pretty close with my family. And then obviously with the pandemic, it's made things more challenging. So if I was a little closer to them, it'd be ideal. But I think that it's definitely, moving to Ann Arbor has given me all the opportunities more than I know what to do with. And so I would say that one's my favorite.
Yeah. And sometimes I find, like, I really miss my family and I wish I could be closer, but at the same time, you only have so much time in a day, and it minimizes, this is it sounds like really selfish, but it minimizes my distractions, because if I were back home, I would just oh my gosh, spend every Saturday night hanging out with my fam. Yeah. Whereas now I can be working on my podcast or something yeah.
And I'm a very emotional person. I feel emotions very strongly. And so I kind of I've learned to kind of shut that emotional brain off when I need to focus on labs and focus on things here. I can't miss my family, tremendously, and have that emotional hurt and distraction, and also be able to thrive here. And so I've started to practice more lately, turning that emotional brain off, and it doesn't mean that I don't miss my family, obviously, but it's not mentally healthy for it to be at the front of my mind at all times, Mm-hmm. And so that's what I've tried to do lately. It's not easy, though. It takes a lot of mental energy to, make part of your brain quiet, right? So mm-hmm. Sometimes it pops back up and I get homesick, but thankfully I was able to have a good visit just a couple weeks ago and catch up with everyone.
And thankfully we have things like this Zoom.
Yeah, no kidding.
They're not the best, but they're better than nothing.
Absolutely, for sure.
You shared with me privately, and you just shared a little bit on the Zoom, that you have ADD, or maybe you call it ADHD. I don't know. What do you call it?
I have ADHD, but they're similar. Mm-hmm.
And that you actually want to do more research to the connection with the gut. And you've told me, and ADHD, and to see if there's a correlation there. And then you also you mentioned your boss has been a really great mentor, and he's flexible. And you mentioned with me privately, he works really well with your ADHD and knowing the kind of environment and what you need to be better, be your best mentally, be your best productivity wise, what tips would you give other places to make an environment for someone with ADHD? Because I find that a lot of people have ADHD, whether they know it or not. I watched this guy named Dr. Amen, and he takes like brain scans, and he says there's all these different types and different ways they can manifest. Someone that has it one way could manifest completely, especially girls are underdiagnosed because we manifest completely differently. So what would be your tips for other workplaces and how your mentor has really handled it well?
Sure. So this is this is pretty close to my heart. It's not really talked about in academia very much, anything with ADHD, and the struggles of anyone with like a cognitive disability would go through. There's not a ton of students at this level with it. And so I would say that the biggest tip that I found to be the most productive is starting to talk about it. And so I would say in my master's degree and my undergrad, and I had great mentors there, but I tried to hide it, that I was struggling with all of these things. And I just thought if I work 12 hours a day instead of my peers having to work 8 hours a day, I can get the same amount done. And so no one will notice, and I'll just put in the extra work because I have to, because it takes me longer to do things, some specific things more than others, like writing. I take forever to write. And so I found
labs, I feel like when I used to be with you in school, you were just like, you would be the first one done.
So it was definitely not diagnosed at that point. But there's definitely certain things that I have no trouble focusing on. Like if I'm, part of ADHD is kind of hyper focusing. And so if I find something super fascinating, it's new, I'm excited about it, I have no problem getting super into it and focusing. It's when I'm not excited about things that it's like almost feels painful to have to do. Like I'm not good, or I don't enjoy writing, like scientific writing. And it's just a mental battle of getting myself to, start to do those things. And so in my master's degree, like I said, I tried to hide these things, and I wasn't like open with my boss or my peers that I had this. And I was still trying to navigate and figure out what ADHD meant for me, and what symptoms that I'd had for years that I didn't realize were a part of this disease. Or this disorder more so. And so I found that was a lot more mentally draining. And so when I moved here, I started to make a point to talk about it more. And that's made all the difference. Like my mentor wouldn't have any idea that I'm struggling with these things if I had never told him that I struggled with ADHD, And so he's now, since he's been encouraging with helping me figure out like a day-to-day schedule and environment that works the best for me, it's really made all the difference. Like I've seen students that are in doctoral programs, and for whatever reason, their mentors are not, they don't jive well with the student. And the student with ADHD ends up failing and ends up having to stop their program because it's just too difficult, or they're not reaching the criteria and the checkpoints, that the neurotypical students are reaching. And so I am lucky in that my interactions with my mentor have helped me learn more about my symptoms and about what works for me. I would say at the very beginning, it was a lot of trial and error. I have certain things that I can do that kind of trick my brain into focusing. Like, for example, if I put on these noise canceling headphones, I've tried to make a routine when I'm focusing. So then when I do those things, even if I'm a little more distracted that day, it kind of tricks my brain into thinking, oh, it's time to focus. Like I put these headphones on. I used to chew gum when I was focusing. And so then if I put the headphones on and chewed the gum, then it would kind of help me get into that focused state. But it's definitely been like trial and error and error and error. Thankfully, I have a lot of great coworkers that have helped me identify some of like the symptoms of ADHD. And so then I can look into online other people that have struggled with that and how they've overcome it. So reading a lot about it has also helped. But it's more about, it's made me a lot more like in tune with my emotions and with what's going on in my brain. Like before I would feel this way and I didn't understand why I felt that way. And I didn't understand why my feelings about this subject were so different than what my peers were feeling about this subject, And so having this understanding of, there's like a physical reason why I'm feeling this way and why it's so different than my peers. And that's okay. And that's it. Really, when I started talking about it, it removed a lot of the guilt, which shouldn't be associated with it, obviously, because it's nothing that we can do to, like, it's not my fault I have ADHD, Mm-hmm. But I stopped being kind of embarrassed about it and I stopped trying to hide my symptoms. And so now I've learned to kind of make them a strength and talk about them. So I talk about them freely now. I've gotten comfortable to where I can talk about them. And my hope is that if someone is struggling with the same things and, they haven't realized that there's a physiological reason that you're thinking this way and that you're feeling differently than your peers, that this can help me by me talking about it and speaking about it so freely that can help them figure out what works for them.
Yeah, I like that. That's so important. I think we're seeing a lot of support for depression, anxiety, and things online. And so support for, I think, ADD or ADHD on, like, I haven't heard so much about that one being like support for it. So yeah, it is a not mental illness, but a mental disorder, right? Sure. So It should be treated it should have just as much support for people. And I found that, like, because ADHD and ADD, it is kind of like a superpower as well. Like you said, like you can hyper focus on things. Mm-hmm. So a lot of people that are like super creative have it, and a lot of CEOs have it that are like super very successful. Like it's like 75% of like really successful CEOs have ADHD or something like crazy. Yeah. So I think that if there's less shame of it and more of like, okay, this has benefits, but it's also has things that makes you struggle daily. So how can for me, it was like having my own, like my job now, I have my own office versus the other place. I was like right next to 3 people and my boss was constantly chewing nicotine and looking over my shoulder,
that wouldn't work,
my ear and breathing on me. And so that was really hard for me to focus, obviously, when he's breathing on me all day. Sure. But now that I have my own office, and I can put in headphones, it's so much easier for me to focus. So simply something that simple of like an environment change. I think companies are going to see that with working from home and like productivity there. So, that definitely threw a wrench into, like, I felt like I was just getting used to what worked for me in lab, and then the pandemic hit and I had to start working from home. And so that forced me to figure out ways to get it to work in my home environment too, but I definitely think that until I wasn't able to focus on the qualities or the aspects of ADHD that I could use to my benefit and that I could use to make me a better scientist and a better person, I wasn't able to focus on it, like exploiting those, until I had removed the shame part of it. And so I would definitely say that talking about it in general, takes the shame out of it. And, the more people that I told, I found it pretty empowering, and getting help for it first as a step. I've never been diagnosed, but I'm sure I probably have something.
Yeah, which I actually went through a neuropsychological testing in order to get like treated for it here in Michigan once I moved. And that was actually incredibly interesting. Like it was like a 4-hour test. I had to do all sorts of different things. And a psychologist basically mapped out my brain. It feels like she told me that I was able to learn that I learn the best through hearing, not through reading. Like I thought I had a partially like photographic memory. And it turns out that I retain more when I hear things. I found that I was on the 99th percentile of inattentiveness and hyperactivity. So then it was like, okay, this is why I've been having all of these problems. Like it kind of validated, it made me confident that the things that I was struggling with weren't just in my head, like this is a psychologist that just diagnosed you with this and said that your brain is different than other people's. And so I got a lot of like liberation from that, I would say as well. Just recognizing that it's not just you, is also pretty empowering. Like I overthink everything. And so when I have a feeling or a thought, I'm like, is this me being like me overreacting, or is this a like normal thought to have, And so that was really liberating in that sense, to learn that the things that I was thinking are because of this disorder, this illness, and not just my brain,
With new DNA technology available, like to the public, like 23andMe, how do you see that changing the future of how we prepare for diseases we are predisposed to genetically?
Okay, back to the science.
A loaded question.
I think that those things, so I have the school of thought that more knowledge is never a bad thing. And so I think that learning more about the genetic predispositions that you have, it can definitely potentially even improve the outlook of those diseases, So for example, if I know that I'm more predisposed to having hypertension, then I might start to adapt a diet that is lower in salt. Whereas if I didn't know that I was predisposed for that, then I might just be eating a normal diet, and not paying attention to the salt. And so the hypertension would develop. Whereas if I know about it beforehand, and a lot of these predispositions, we know generally what causes them. And so I think it's a really good thing, actually. It can help you kind of give you a better picture of what's going on in your body and what potentially could develop in the future. And so you can make changes to prevent those things from actually developing. If that
have you used 23andMe?
I haven't. I want to. Partially because I just find it cool. I also considered doing it with my cat. There's pet ones now. I don't know if you've done it with your dogs.
Yeah, I've tested my dog's DNA.
Is it cool?
I haven't done mine, but I've done my dog's.
Same. I'm like,
yeah,
I just spend money on the pets, but not. Yeah.
I didn't do the health one, but I spent money on the to find out what she is, the percentages, and it came back like crazy different things. Like she's like 25% boxer, which I never would have guessed. She has chow chow in her and like chihuahua, and like
she does not.
I never would have thought those things, but now that I look at the mix, I'm like, oh, I can kind of see it now, because she's got like the orange fur that chow chows have.
Yeah.
And she's got like this little face, but then this big like chest that a boxer would have. So it kind of makes sense, I guess.
And actually her personality probably too, you can have some indication, like if you know if she's part chow chow and they have very distinct personality traits, that you can help identify those things.
But speaking of, Megan rescues cats. Can you tell us a little bit how you got into that?
Sure. Actually, it's kind of to be very transparent, I went through a breakup a couple of years ago, and I thought that I could either, work through this heartache in a way that's destructive and is not positive for me as a person, or I could work through this heartache in a way that's going to help other people or other things. And that's literally the thought that I had when I started it.
So you were like, okay, I'm single.
Like,
I'm going to become the crazy cat lady.
no, like I could fall into like drinking more and doing destructive behaviors, or I could use my time and my energy on taking care of these little fluffs. And so I started fostering, and my first litter was 4 kittens, and they had just been brought into the shelter. And it's extremely difficult because they're very like messy and very taxing emotionally, but it's so rewarding. I've now fostered 33 kittens, cats in the last year and a half, and 2 of them have been moms that have given birth in my apartment.
Wow.
But then it's also extremely cool because I get to see that process, and I'm obviously like interested in health, so that's really cool. But then I get to see these newborn kittens grow until 8 weeks old when they go back to the shelter to get fixed and microchipped and adopted out. But you get to see the whole process. Like, none of my friends or colleagues have ever seen like a 2-week-old kitten or a 3-week-old kitten. Like, it's an opportunity that I wouldn't have if I didn't foster. And so it's really, really cool to see them grow and see their little personalities develop. And obviously they're super cute and fluffy. So it's really, I've learned a lot about myself and about like caring for others. I'm the type of person that I feel like I'm my best person when I'm able to care for others. And so it satisfies that caring requirement for me. And so now I have a foster cat that was very, very feral. And so I'm teaching her how to be a house cat and domesticating her. And it's so rewarding. I can't even describe it. Like, when you have a cat that's never been touched by humans 6 months ago, now she's walking up to me asking for pets. It's just a really cool thing to watch. So
yeah,
I highly recommend it to anyone.
Yeah, I think I've always, a lot of people, they like to get a puppy from the start versus adopting. Sure. And I know that's frowned upon, obviously. But they say like, oh, I want to like teach it from young.
Like influence its personality.
Yeah, which is a cool experience. But at the same time, I think adopting a pet, they're not perfect, but they're quirky. And I think those little quirks make them extra special. Like, Dylan is like the most quirky dog ever. He's kind of like a cat. Like, he climbs up on your shoulder and he's like, he constantly has to be like, I don't know if that's a cat, but he constantly has to be on you. And then Layla has like a lot of quirks. She's just, she loves to be rubbed in the morning, but not at night. And so she doesn't want to be like around you at night, but then in the morning she comes and like lays on her back and is like, rub me. It's my appointment.
So I have a cat named Nacho. That's the same way. Like, he doesn't want to cuddle in the evening. Don't even touch him. But he's always like near me in the same room. But then in the morning, he like wakes me up to cuddle. And I'm like, okay, I guess. It's really cool to be able to, which I got Nacho as a kitten, but then I foster failed one, which is when you fail to give it back. So that one is her, like, I learn new quirks about her all the time. And it's really cool to see like their personalities come out. And that's what makes them like one in a million pet. Like, I know that I'm never going to have a cat with the exact same quirks as Nacho. And so it just teaches you to appreciate different aspects about them. And obviously with the pandemic, like they increased my quality of life tenfold, having an animal around just in general. So
speaking of, we didn't want to get on this podcast and talk to science and not mention with the pandemic, is there anything that you think people should know, any advice moving forward that you have seen given your background in diseases, and anything you want to PSA?
So I think my PSA would be to try to remember, like, I can't speak for every scientist on earth, obviously, but I'm without a doubt very confident that the research that's going on is not being done to like dupe anyone or to get someone to, believe things that they shouldn't, so I feel like with the changing like recommendations, a lot of people, like I mentioned earlier, feel like we don't know what's going on, which we don't. In a general sense, when the pandemic hit, we didn't know anything about this virus. And so I guess my PSA is just that, like, the scientists are working hard to figure out what's going on, and just to be open with the fact that we're still learning. And we're going to get information about the coronavirus and about what it does to your body when you have it, what it does to your body after you recover. Those things are all going to be coming in as new information. And I think it's important for like the general population to remember that just because we know that now and we didn't know that in the beginning, like there's
doesn't mean it was to try to
like we didn't hide that from you from the beginning. Exactly. Like we're just learning more about it as more research is going on. And similar to that.
And I think scientists have been open about that from the beginning. Like they've been, I mean, from the beginning, I remember here, like whenever I heard a scientist speak, they're like, this is just so you know, this is changing. Like I could say this now and you quote me and then it's going to look really bad at 3 weeks because this is all changing.
Yeah. Which with the like political climate, I think separating, going back and remembering that the science is not the political aspect of it. I think keeping in mind that those are more separate than they've come to be now, it seems to be very intertwined, and just reminding people that the scientific recommendations are not like, it's not to satisfy a political agenda. Like the reason why we scientists spend so many hours and spend, like I'll have 12 years of college to be able to research what I do at the end. And we wouldn't go through that, I guess, if we weren't caring about the people, like the broad goal is to help people. And so I guess just reminding people, which if they've never talked to a scientist, they might not know that, but like we do what we do to try to help. And so keeping in mind that that's not based off of like a political agenda, and yeah, I guess that's my PSA. And it's also, I know a lot of people are concerned about like vaccines coming out recently, and how quickly that vaccine was developed. I've read many people that are very concerned about that. And I want to make it clear that you wouldn't know this if you weren't in the field, but typically there's like grants that you apply for on all of these different diseases. And if you get funding for them, then you have the money to study this disease for a couple of years, right? And so essentially in like when the coronavirus started in America, basically all of the research stopped. And so where before the pandemic, it would be competitive to get a grant to study your disease just because there's so many people doing research. Whereas after it started, money was being like, it was very easy to get a grant to study. It was very easy to get a grant to study coronavirus because it was such like, and this is what we trained to do, and so there was essentially endless funding to study this because it was so important and affecting so many people. And so the rate at which, I would remind people that the rate at which the vaccine was developed doesn't necessarily, like we can't compare that to the development of treatments for diseases when we were studying 1 million diseases, like everything stopped and all the scientists started studying coronavirus. So it's not as quick and understudied as some people probably feel it is, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the kind of vaccine that it is, what's it called? RNC something?
mRNA.
mRNA. Clearly, I'm not a scientist.
No, you have the letters. You're good.
This is funny. I follow this like Botox guy that like does lip injections and nose jobs in St. Louis. His name's Dr. Nyack, Nose by Nyack. You've probably seen the billboards. He actually did his research studying mRNA type stuff. And that was way before he was a doctor. So although it wasn't a vaccine yet, they have been studying this, right?
Yeah. So mRNA is just like we use mRNA to be able to tell how much genes are turned on. mRNA is not a new thing by any means.
It's just never been used in a vaccine.
It's like, exactly. Yeah. And which honestly, I personally feel more confident about this vaccine. Partially something that entices me about it is that there isn't a lot of like fillers or anything. Like there's the mRNA, if I understand correctly, there's the mRNA, and then there's like the lipids and the molecules needed for the body to accept that mRNA and get it into its cells, which a lot of like cells, they recognize lipids and they let lipids inside of their cell, whereas other structures, they may need a receptor or a transporter to bring them into the cell. So the things that it seems to be just the mRNA and then the things that are required to get it into the cells. And there's no like any preservatives. That's why it has to be kept at such low temperatures, is because there aren't preservatives in there. And that makes me more confident in a vaccine, which I'm pro-vax all the way. But anytime when we're having less preservatives and fillers, I think that's a good thing. And so I just got my invitation to schedule my vaccine appointment, and I'm pretty excited about it. I think it'll really make big strides in starting to get life back to normal, back to not what it was completely, obviously, but I think it'll really help in opening up the economy a little more and making people feel more comfortable.
Mm-hmm. Well, good luck. That's exciting. Thanks so much. Did you have any more questions?
No.
Did you have anything else you wanted to share before we get off here?
No.
All right. Well, this was awesome. You are just
thank you so much.
Smart and fascinating.
Thank you for having me.
I feel so blessed to have you as my friend and to have grown up with
I
you.
feel the same.
I mean, Megan and I go way back. We used to she dealt with me being like the bitchiest little bossy friend in second grade. And I would call her up like every Wednesday, and we would come to school in the same exact outfit, all the way from what we wore to our socks to we had to pack the same lunch. Our hair had to look the same.
Yeah, I'm sure we've got pictures around.
Yeah, we have one where we're like doing the splits, and like we both were wearing those like Skechers skate shoes.
Skates, yeah.
So cute.
Yeah.
But, thanks so much. This means a lot that you came on here, and
thanks for having me
back on again sometime.
Absolutely.
Right. Hopefully the world will be in a better state and we can come visit you in Michigan or something.
Please do.
Do it in person.
You're always welcome.
All right. Bye.
Bye.